I have entitled this lesson Entertaining Angels, which is a phrase that is found in the book of Hebrews, chapter 13, verse 2. And we'll touch on that in a second. But the point being, Abraham was playing host in this passage to divine persons, not only God, but two divine helpers who were along with Yahweh in this story. And as the story will go forward, we'll be considering whether or not his hospitality was a direct result of him knowing that he was in service to God, in this case, in a very in the flesh sort of way, or whether or not this is the sort of hospitality that we may have expected anyone in his time, if they were a moral and upright person, to show a stranger. And then we'll also talk about Sarah's laughter at the end of this passage. The story begins at a place that by now should be familiar. Chapter 18, verse 1 reads, "The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground." You may well guess that most of chapter 18 and into chapter 19 comes from the J source, the Yahwist source, the tip-off being the use of the word Lord in all with a capital letter at the beginning, which is usually the way that in English Yahweh is translated. But also, as we'll read, you'll see that the God we meet in this passage is highly anthropomorphized, walking, sitting, talking, and even eating with Abraham. One other thing I should note is that this encounter happens at the heat of the day, meaning in the middle of the day. And so you would expect someone like Abraham to be just sitting in his tent in the shade, waiting until the evening hours where things were cooler, where you might go out and do some work outside if you needed to, or to begin to prepare your food around a fire that would have been intolerably hot in the heat of the day, but more tolerable in the evening. So you wouldn't expect there to be strangers walking around or making their travel time in the broad daylight in this kind of weather. But also, as I mentioned earlier, this encounter takes place at a familiar location by the oaks of Mamre, or is sometimes translated the terebinths of Mamre. The Hebrew is a bit ambiguous. It's hard to know exactly what tree in specific is being mentioned here, but just think large, significant, important, holy trees. Commentary on Genesis 18 by Samuel Guerre, in that commentary, he writes, "Abraham is reclining beneath the terebinths of Mamre. Recall for a moment the significance of this place, which, among other things, was the place where Abram built an altar to the Lord after the covenant was renewed. There is a tradition cited by Josephus that the terebinth at Mamre is as old as the world itself, and another tradition that this place where Abraham was circumcised is the spot upon which the altar in the temple of the Lord would eventually stand." But that is tradition. We can't know that. What unfolds under and around the terebinths of Mamre unfolds in a holy place. That is the point of continuing to mention that he finds himself back at the oaks or the terebinths of Mamre, about to have another significant encounter with God. Now, one might think that by Abraham running out to greet the strangers and then prostrating himself before them, that he is acknowledging an appearance of the divine. This is, in fact, not the case. At this point in the narration, only we readers know that this is the Lord, that this is Yahweh, capital Lord. Abraham is merely showing hospitality in keeping with the customs of his day. He is treating the strangers as he is expected to treat strangers, with deference and lavish generosity. And you can read about the protocols for encountering strangers in other parts of the Bible, but then also in other writings in the ancient Near East. This is what was expected. This was protocol. Just as we would maybe open our door and give a kind greeting and say, "May I take your coat?" This is that day's version of those sorts of manners. Verse 3, he said, "My Lord," point out before I move on, this word here translated Lord is not Yahweh. So more keep in line with what I was just saying. This is the word Adonai, which could be used in reference to the divine or in reference to a very important personage. And in this context, it is in reference to somebody who Abraham is trying to elevate by use of language. More on that in a second. He said, "My Lord, If I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Note that he is casting himself in the role of servant. Again, this is in keeping with the customs of the time. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So they said, do as you have said. As I've been saying, all of this is in keeping with societal norms in Abraham's day. One was expected to treat strangers well, as it was all but certain that one will find oneself in a similar circumstance sometime in the future and in need of aid. So in the ancient Near East, it was customary to treat strangers with radical hospitality. Such overtures of generosity and respect give the strangers, quote, the freedom to respond without embarrassment. Fratham would go on to write, Abraham's hospitality has several characteristics. It extends to strangers, toward those who appear unexpectedly. It follows a certain protocol, seeing, running, to meet, honoring, inviting, refreshing, preparing, serving, bowing. An everyday gesture was appropriate for all visitors, not only for important people. What you have is an ethic at play here that its goal is about survival in the wilderness. So it's not like here in Indianapolis, obviously, a very populous city where you might knock on any number of doors to find help. You might run into one family or one small community of family members along with their servants. And if they were not willing to show you hospitality, then it was a matter of life and death. Your only other option would be to continue wandering in this case, the heat of the day, or on into the night in search of resources that were very scarce. And so an ethic of radical hospitality developed in this context, where you try to diffuse any potential for violent confrontation by elevating the status of your guest with words that put you in the role of servant and elevated the other to a place above oneself, so that when you went and found yourself in a similar circumstance, you could expect that person to also be keeping the customs of the day, referring to you deferentially and preparing for you a meal that they would not have otherwise set for their family on any other average day. And so that's the ethic that we have at play here. And this is documented, as I said, in other parts of the Torah, where literal descriptions of how to greet foreigners is laid out in detail, but then also other ancient texts from cultures that were also in this area laid out a similar ethic. And it's no accident that this passage is placed before the story of Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction. The contrast between how Abraham treats these heavenly persons and how Sodom will treat them is meant to be held up in contrast to one another. And that's where we'll really focus on next week. But I bring it up to say there are parallels between this story, and that is intentional. And we are meant to read these stories side by side, which is why they're placed together. Which also will help us understand better what was really wrong with the practices of Sodom and Gomorrah. And again, more on that next week, not to get ahead of ourselves. The text goes on, verse 6, and Abraham hastened to the tent to Sarah and said, make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it and make cakes. Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds of milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. So you're meant to picture Abraham standing by in attendance, putting him in the role that his servants would usually find themselves in should there not have been guests there. So what began as a modest meal has turned into a lavish feast. Abraham, the host, hurried to prepare the meal and serve only the best food. Meat was reserved for special occasions. The term translated curds here may refer to leban, a common Middle Eastern dairy product similar to yogurt. Abraham, standing in attendance while his guests sit and feast, indicates Abraham's continued deference to the strangers. All of this is, again, I emphasize, right and appropriate given the customs of the day. Also, let me just point out, God eats. This is in keeping with the J sources, the Yahweh sources image of God, who is often portrayed in anthropomorphic ways. We call God walking in the garden. This is a God that manifests It's God's self as someone walking around with four limbs, 2 arms, and 2 legs. And as we continue to go forward, this is a God that you can debate with and bargain with and talk down. That will be something we talk about next week at the back half of chapter 18 and on into chapter 19. I just pointing out that there are different God images at play in the Torah. And if we were, say, reading a story from the priestly source, God would not have been coming down in this sort of way. God would have spoken from the divine places, perhaps from a mountain or from the sky or perhaps in a dream. But here, God, Yahweh, make no mistake about it, Yahweh, Lord God, comes and sits down and ingests food. Verse 9, they said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There, in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So some scholars divide this second part of the story apart from the first, but there is a clear break or shift in the tenor of the story. The first half is about the hospitality that Abraham meets out on these strangers. And now the passage turns to this ongoing theme of a promise for Abraham to have offspring. And now, after last week, we know for sure it's going to happen by way of Sarah. And we don't know if Abraham hasn't communicated this to Sarah or what we're supposed to think here. Last week's was from the priestly source, and this is the Yahweh source. So we don't, whilst the person who put them and compiled them into the Torah is trying to weave a seamless narrative, it would be surprising to me if these two literary schools were in conversation with one another when they were writing down their stories. So we could just imagine maybe Sarah wasn't told, or perhaps this is a story that could operate apart from last week's story. But either way, Sarah is finding out about this. And the divine messenger says, "I will come back next year and you will have a son." So the plot now shifts to a discussion about Lord God's promise to offspring for Abraham and Sarah. And it's unclear at what point Abraham becomes aware that he is entertaining Yahweh in divine attendance, but this may well be the moment. And in the verses that will come after today's text, it's clear that Abraham has finally gotten the idea this is God that I'm communing with. But this may be the moment where the scales fall from Abraham's eyes and he understands who he's treating with this lavish meal. Because who else would know of or speak so freely about God's promises that were made previously, or who would even know about them? And then the old problem by now, is restated. Abraham and Sarah are too old to have children. The phrase, "it had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women," is in reference to her being post-menopausal. Verse 12, so Sarah laughed to herself, saying, presumably to herself, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "Oh yes, you did laugh." As we said last week, the story parallels the story that we considered last week when it was Abraham who laughed and did far more than that. He fell on his face and laughed at this divine revelation and says something similar to himself. These incredulous words, he can hardly believe what he is hearing. Handel writes in my HarperCollins Study Bible Commentary, "This is itself a comical scene. As Sarah is listening in on the conversation between Abraham and his guests and she doesn't realize that God is also listening in on her. And so you've got eavesdropping going both ways. And as I was saying last week, when I was looking for pictures of this scene, I found lots of pictures of Sarah laughing in a way that was derisive, or ways that were unflattering to Sarah, as if her laughter was a sign that she lacked some sort of moral fiber or faith or the ability to receive the news well. And Freetham, along this line, along these themes, writes that male commentators discussing this passage have often been unfair to Sarah, excusing Abraham's laughter in the previous chapter, but judging Sarah severely. I even found videos of sermons where the whole point was, don't laugh at God. Sarah laughed at God. She learned a lesson. And many Old Testament texts, though, actually depict humans questioning God as a natural part of a genuine God-human conversation. And Abraham will shortly do just that. We'll cover that next week. Moses will, of course, do that in his interactions with the Egyptians, and also going forward as they wander through the desert. And then Gideon will do this in the book of Judges. And in this case, God's response continues the conversation, and God makes no judgment, even when Sarah denies that she has laughed. Just says, oh, yes, you did, and leaves it alone, and there's no chastisement. One is also reminded of how Mary responded to the angel's pronouncement in Luke chapter 1:34, where Mary too doesn't say that she laughed, but she found the claims of the divine messenger just too astonishing to buy into all at once. This question, is anything too wonderful, or sometimes translated hard? The Hebrew is hard to translate here, but it seems to mean, is this a task too large for the Lord? Seems to be the point in verse 14. It's difficult to understand. The text probably presents a genuine question designed to continue the conversation, not a rhetorical question. In other words, this isn't an answer, as with a rhetorical question, where you say something perhaps in sarcasm. This is a question that is meant to continue the dialogue, where the person who hears the question might say, I don't know. Is it? Let's wait and see. This question is always before humanity. We remain in hope that God's promises will come to fruition, whilst wondering, is anything too wonderful or too hard or too difficult for God? The God in the Hebrew Bible seems to say no again and again and again, but the question always crops up. Meanwhile, we, along with Abraham and Sarah, wait and see. It's where we find ourselves now, in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of tumultuous times, political tensions. We are wondering, can God bring humanity together? Is anything too wonderful, too hard for God? We wait and see. But the narratives of the Bible and of those way back when say no. That's a faith claim and a hope that we cling to as people of faith. It's an amazing thing. Then this passage ends abruptly, right after Yahweh says, yes, you did laugh. Sarah's confronted, denies having laughed. And then it ends. And Freitham writes, the end of this segment seems incomplete, but the intent may well be to leave the reader and Sarah and Abraham in a state of some uncertainty concerning what the future will bring. In keeping with what I was just saying, perhaps the point is this unanswered question and the feeling of what next, what now? Let's wait and see what happens. And of course, as the story goes forward, Sarah does indeed bear a child. But here are the takeaways from today's passages, the ones that I want to bring out and emphasize. And the first has to do with the hospitality, the rules of engagement that we see at play in this story. The story begins with a demonstration of hospitality that in its day would have been commonplace, but by today's standards seems radical. Just this week, no joke, I was visited by a stranger who rang my doorbell at 1:30 a.m. Did I run and greet him, bow down, and then sit him down to a lavish feast? No way. Modern culture presents numerous challenges to the practice of hospitality toward others. In North American culture, people live increasingly isolated lives, seldom reaching out beyond a very close circle. We live in a self-protective age where parents must warn their children about strangers. Who knows what might be lurking beneath a kind and gentle facade? Hence, we seldom move out towards strangers. Hospitality in the modern world entails some risk of moving toward the stranger with less than full certainty as to how one might be received. Such hospitality should be especially important in the life of worship. Worship ought to be a setting in which the stranger is welcomed in premier ways. So I guess what lies behind this paragraph is, now in a city and in modern times, things are far more complicated, but how can we bring the spirit behind this kind of generosity and hospitality that elevates the other and puts yourself in the role of servant to the other, in order to build a bond, in order to build a bond of care a bond that only care and compassion can really build. What might that look like? And I'm not advocating for letting somebody in your house at 1:30 a.m. I actually suspect the person who rang my doorbell had some mental health issues, and I learned about this person later through some neighborhood apps that this is something that he does. He goes around and knocks door to door in the middle of the night, making strange requests. So I'm not saying to be reckless, but the spirit behind this radical display of hospitality, what might that look like in our churches and in our homes as we wisely and with discernment try to apply the spirit behind this practice? Why should we practice radical hospitality? Because all persons are made in God's image. When you welcome the stranger, you welcome God. Abraham did not at first know that he was playing host to God. He had failed to, if he had failed to welcome the stranger, he would have failed to welcome God. Could it be that God rang my doorbell at 1:30 a.m.? In a way, the answer is already provided. As I said before, all persons are made in God's image. Hebrews 13 verses 1-2 reads, "Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it." As for Sarah's laughter, who can blame her? The impossible was prophesied about her. God does not seem to flinch at our incredulity. In fact, her laughter becomes something of an ongoing inside family joke in the naming of her future child, Isaac, which, as was covered last week, literally means laughter. We should ask ourselves the following question: when do we laugh at possibilities for blessing that seem as unlikely to us as 90-year-old Sarah giving birth? So two things. It's okay to laugh and find some of the hopeful claims of our faith, to find them a bit much. But then at the same time, on the other side of laughter, we can hope for and cling to these promises and expectation that something's got to break. Next week, we'll consider the remainder of chapter 18, where Abraham actually bargains with God and talks God down from one idea to something like a compromise. Again, this is the Yahweh's God, where you can do that. And then of Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction in chapter 19. And whilst you read what follows, ask yourself, what great sin did these two cities commit? What actions brought divine retribution down on their heads? Hint, hint, the generosity of Abraham is meant to be viewed as a parallel opposite to the ways of Sodom. But more on that next week. The room together. Well, hi, Connie.
I just joined partway through that. So.
Oh, you'll have to catch the front half when I put the video up.
Yeah.
So I was curious, how do they cook a calf that fast?
or make cakes that fast.
Well, I can see throwing some bread, some oil, some water, throwing in the pan, and it's done in 10 minutes.
Yeah,
I could see that, but
the calf.
Do they ever explain that?
Well, I think that it's a detail in the story that has less to do with the logistics and more to do with the gesture. So, you're right. You can't cook a calf that fast. And it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work if you were, it'd be like those moments in a sitcom where everything resolves itself in a way that isn't in keeping with reality, or where where you miss. There's like, wait a second, you can't, whatever the task is at hand. It's, I never even thought of that, to be honest with you, because I'm not.
Well, I'm used to being in the kitchen, so.
Yeah.
That really stood out to me, because coming from a farm, I thought, my gosh, it'd take a while just to go get the calf rounded up.
Yeah, I suppose you could take the calf, kill it, slice off some meat, and throw it in a pan or over a fire and cook it in a half an hour or so. But every time I read this, I think, okay, well, this must be nighttime by the time they finish the meal. But of course they don't, the rest of the story doesn't indicate that it's late in the day.
The dialogue just seems pretty short and terse and to the point. Yeah, I never even noticed that. It's funny the things that different people from different perspectives in life or different experiences. I've never slow cooked anything in my life. I might have thrown things in the crock pot per Kelly's instruction and set it to the dial to the exact place that she wrote down when she was out and about. But I've never done anything that serious. Yeah, if we were, you may remember in the first 2 or 3 weeks, we talked about the Midrash as a tradition, where you have this dialogue about it that wasn't so much fixated on getting it historically pinned down, but more about what implications could be in what's not there. So I guess you could say maybe this was a period of 12 hours to a full day of dialogue between Abraham and.
Well, we knew it was in the heat of the day. So we're talking 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right?
Yes.
Mhm.
And next the text quickly moves away from this scene, and Abraham basically walks them out, not out of the tent, but on their journey. And they have this dialogue where at this point it's clear that Abraham knows he's talking to Yahweh, and refers to Yahweh as the God who is the judge of creation. So understands that. And where that transition happens, I think perhaps the most plausible would be where Yahweh names the promise that has been made to Abraham and then now to Sarah, because how else would this stranger have known about that? But it's hard telling.
So why are there 3?
Well, in the 2nd century common era after Jesus, theologians were like, the Trinity. The writers of this did not have that in mind. It was common for a god in that day to be accompanied by divine attendants. Actually, I didn't include it in this lesson, but there are other similar stories from other religious traditions in Mesopotamia, in that area, where there are 3, a divine personage accompanied by 2 hand servants, people who are meant to carry the luggage, I guess.
But when they get to Sodom and Gomorrah, there are only 2.
Yeah,
right?
And in the silence, people speculate, and there neither one is Yahweh. They're both the messenger, the divine messengers, the divine servants, and that leads some to speculate. Well, Gomorrah gets destroyed too, so maybe the 3rd goes off there, but it's not stated. It's not, and that right there shows you how different stories and fragments of stories woven together with the appearance of a seamless narrative can sometimes not reconcile these details, right? If the same person who was compiling the story we just heard, it would have been an oral tradition just now getting written down. It probably would have been told for perhaps centuries in the form that we are now experiencing it. But then there have been other stories like that. And now what's the person who scholars call the redactor, or the persons probably called the redactors, meaning the ones who were putting it together in the Torah that we don't have until the 4th century BC. They didn't change things. They would just keep what they had and try to weave it in. And so sometimes I'm glad they didn't change things, because it would have been a dishonest thing. So sometimes they'll put a snippet or scrap or you'll notice a detail that just doesn't seem to fit with what you just read. And this, I think, could be something like that. Because if I were trying to work out a more fleshed out narrative and I was dealing with, say, 2 stories, the story we read today and then what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah, and I was seeing them in line of a common narrative, that would be a detail that just you're mediocre to average writer would have tried to at least, then the 3 of them went here, but that's not what we get.
Is it possible that at that time in history, you would never travel alone? You would always travel with companions just for safety?
That's true. That's true. It was a bad idea because there were brigands and brigands. I don't remember the last time I even heard that word. There were there, there were
Wigan. Yeah.
brigands. There were robbers. That, and those are in Jesus's day, those the people who mugged the Good Samaritan, not the Good Samaritan, who mugged the person the Good Samaritan helped. That's the idea. Certain roads were known to be dangerous.
I was also taken in this story that Sarah seemed to remain in the tent. I mean, Abraham says, prepare the bread, etc. And then they ask, where is your wife? I mean, she doesn't seem to be a part of this, even when they were eating out under the trees or whatever. And yet the Lord wanted to get this message to her. Was that just custom that the women kind of stayed in the background?
Probably.
Plausible. I did not consider that question.
Mhm, mhm.
I have a whole book on the lives of women in biblical times, and I bet you that's in there. And I'll try to make a note to maybe at the beginning of next week have that answer, because that's a good question.
Well, since they were basically considered property and not people, it just makes sense.
That's
that,
true.
They're not allowed to come out unless they're requested to come out.
Mhm.
Esther couldn't go to the king unless he said, come, it's okay for you to come in. So,
Yeah.
Mhm, mhm.
But
Yeah.
here, Sarah seems to be playing such an important part in the whole system that, they do ask where she is, and it seems like she might have joined them in the meal, and evidently not.
The thing
Yeah.
about the Bible that that I think it needs to be talked about, two things. One is you see old societal roles that are exploitative practiced in the Bible as it's the air that they breathe in those times. We talked about rules of engagement as it relates to hospitality towards the foreigner. On the other hand, there are these other rules of engagement that are oppressive to different people of lower classes, like slaves and women, and lesser sons, lesser daughters, because the firstborns were preferred, all of these things. But the Bible, in surprising moments, subverts it. So the lesser son gets the inheritance. The woman finds a voice. It doesn't disrupt and throw over the old systems, but challenges it. And if you could look at a trajectory, like into the future, like from there to where we are today, you can see the seeds planted of ideas as they would germinate, would transform the way humans relate to one another, although there's still a lot of work to be done, needless to say, today. And so in the Bible, I think we do a disservice if we ignore the parts that are just unacceptable by today's standards and by what we now believe, by this belief that women and men are both made in God's image, as was said in Genesis chapter 1. This I guess remembering that this was always supposed to be the case. But we do a disservice to ignore the parts that are cringe worthy and then some. At the same time, there are people oftentimes who've fallen out of different branch of Christianity, and I was like this for several years, who had an axe to grind, and I would hyper focus on the passages where God would order the annihilation of an entire people group. Or we'll be talking about that next week as we consider the violence meted out on this entire cities, and whether or not that is how God operates. And so I guess what
Go ahead.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is we need to notice the points that in their context and in their day point towards liberation, although they're not far enough by today's standards, but then also not ignore the nasty stuff. I think that's what's made the Bible in many ways inaccessible to lots of people, because different people with different objectives or understandings of the Bible ignore half of it and elevate another half depending on what their agenda is, rather than dealing with the tension and naming it and not pretending that it's all been reconciled.
So I know it's not just cut and dried like this, and we went over it a little bit like in the first study lessons, but so a literalist interpretation of the Bible versus a contextualist, are those two of the terms that are sort of thrown around, and that's very highly simplified. I know, just like you said, if you throw everything out and you just say you hyper focus on one aspect or the other, but if you say that there are elements of, say, progression in there all along, and you fail to see it, then you don't recognize the whole Bible. But if you only focus on the parts where women are supposed to be subjected to the rule of men, then you're only focusing on other aspects of the Bible. I mean, can you explain those 2 points again? The kind of literalism view. Okay, sorry.
You can be I interrupted you. You can be a literalist and a contextualist at the same time, meaning that you're trying to take everything exactly literally, but then also contextualize it. And I think it's better than just taking everything literally and not contextualizing it. What I'm wanting to say is that through the millennia, up until really the Protestant Reformation, the Bible was read with an understanding that there were a diverse array of perspectives and voices. And the learning about God came from dialogue with these diverse array of perspectives and voices. Also understanding that a lot of the Bible is not meant to be, there was no practice of history. There was no, in academia, there was no, the role of historian was only developing. And so the objectives of the biblical writers wasn't to chronologue history as we now understand it, but to make other points, oftentimes parabolically, just as the parables of Jesus function. You don't need these kings and these servants with their talents to have actually existed to get the point. It was understood that the Bible, broadly speaking, can be accessed that way, with certain parts that were clearly meant to be taken historical. So no one would say that there was no historical Abraham or Moses or David, but then perhaps some of the stories about them carry on more of a parabolic significance rather than a literalist significance. Where this all changed was during the Protestant Reformation, where one point of authority that spoke in one voice, which was the papacy, was first called into question and then outright rejected by a diverse array of reformers, often with competing objectives. And sometimes the reformers persecuted other variants of the Reformation. So, for example, Anabaptists, those who would rebaptized, were caught and drowned by other Protestants because they disagreed. You baptize once. So it was messy, but they felt this need to find another place that spoke like the Pope used to speak. And what they did over the course of a century or two was elevated the Bible to that role, as if it came out of no context, fell from the sky, and there it was. Forgetting that actually the Catholic Church, through the course of 3 centuries, compiled the canon of Scripture that we now hold as the Bible. It's like they got one thing right, and it was the Bible, nothing else. And that's strange credulity to think that you could get one thing right in 3 centuries and then throw out the creeds and everything else. And so the Bible in Europe, and then by extension into North America, was read in a way that it had never really been read before, which is to say it's only saying one thing. It's always consistent, I guess I should say, about everything, and that it is the unfiltered, perfect, every letter word of God.
Yeah.
And in doing that, we have created people who are religious fundamentalists who push people out, and also created whole generations of people who, when they read the Bible in faith, and I was one of them in my youth, who are you find yourself all twisted into different shapes, and you're trying to reconcile the discrepancies. And I feel like we've put generations of people who want to be faithful into an unfair position in doing this to the Bible, into I've got a book that I brought in from the office called The Rise and Fall of the Bible, written by a Christian who is not trying to say that the Bible has fallen, but to say like this popular image of the Bible that rose into ascendancy in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that has since then been the cultural battles, between Christians and the secularists, right? It seems to be waning. That popular image of the Bible was itself cultivated in a certain time and culture, and has not been historically the way that it's been approached. I don't know if that's answering your questions.
Kind of. It seems like a complicated issue.
I like to think of it this way. If you see, if two people see an accident, and then each person's asked to tell about the accident, even if they're standing side by side, they're going to probably have a different story. And if one's standing on one side of a vehicle and the other one's on the other side, they're probably definitely going to have a different view. And from their point of view, it's the truth. That's what they believe they saw.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we can read the Bible and read it one way one day, and 3 months later, you read that very same verse again, and you see a whole different meaning to it. It depends where you are and what's going on in your life.
But I think there are groups, that even groups that I have been asked to join has said, one of the tenets was you must accept every word of the Bible as coming straight from God and it's unchanging. And you must say that, it's the truth and it's perfect as it is. And, we have one way to interpret it and that's it.
Well,
That's
it
the
is
only way.
unchanging. The Bible warns us about anyone that tries to change it. But as I just said, just because I read one verse one day, that doesn't mean I'm going to interpret it the same way 6 months later.
Well,
Each verse speaks differently to us at different times.
I totally agree with you, but I'm saying there are certain groups that limit how much leeway they give people and giving them the freedom to say, that speaks to me in this way.
Yeah, I think I'd stay away from those people.
Exactly. That's why I go to Northwood Christian Church. Yeah.
I tend to, as my role of pastor, I tend to lean in. I've spent a lot of time. I was raised by I was raised in a community that was very much like what we're describing, where there was one very narrow way to read it. But back to what I was saying about taking stories parabolically, it came out a little bit even in this lesson in a way that was very harmless and even in fact fun. But if you're not taking the parabolic meaning, the symbolic, the metaphorical meaning as the point, you might consider how long does it take to cook a fatted calf and think that matters in the story. Now, it's a fun road of inquiry, and you're absolutely right. It takes, if you're going to do it right, it's probably going to take all night. But the point of the fatted calf is to show how Abraham lavished the stranger with this, like the most sumptuous feast he could provide. Mm-hmm. So there's no harm in getting bogged down on the detail in this story, but there are other stories where, take the creation stories, for example, where people push the creation stories into a place where modern readers just cannot access the wisdom in those stories because other people are wanting to insist on taking them absolutely literally. And again, that's a product of trying to find humans intuitively. I think many humans, not every human, but many of us find comfort in the idea that you can find unfiltered truth and consistency from a source. And that's the one-stop shop. And you don't need to deal with any more ambiguity, which in fact, the world is very, and there's a lot of ambiguity in the world and a lot of uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And so when the papacy was no longer that for Christians in Europe, in some European countries, they made the Bible that thing. And in doing so, they've done a great, we've been not intentionally dishonest, but we've forced the Bible into the shape of what we thought we needed, which was a one voice, one stop shop for everything that you needed. And I love the Bible, and it is the place where we learn the most about the people before Jesus, and then for Christian in the Christian scriptures, the life of Jesus, and then the teachings of people who came after Jesus, like Paul and James, or who were contemporaneous with them. But another important component is the centuries that follow of communities that hold these scriptures and try to find out what they mean for them, and to find out what ways the Holy Spirit is calling them even still further down the path towards reconciliation and justice and healthy, wholesome community. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that one of my goals in this class is to not run away from the messiness, and also contextualizing it in its time, finding the profound wisdom that we still need desperately, but then also having a back and forth discussion with it, as we'll read next week, where Abraham says, all right, you say this, Yahweh, how about this? And then Yahweh goes, okay, Yahweh, you see God changing God's mind in this interplay. I feel like feeling like you can have that kind of discussion with reality, and then with God, who is the foundation for our reality, I think was not allowed when I was growing up. And I think that lots of people have left the church as a result of it. Don't get from that I did not thoroughly enjoy the discussion about cooking the fatted calf. I think that was just a detail I thought that was absolutely great. But you don't really need to answer it to get the point of this story. You don't really need it.
I have maybe a very simple way to look at that. And I know this doesn't take in all the variables that you mentioned, Heath, but back in the day when I was having discussions with people in my church, and people were kind of going like, they were like one way people, or I guess back then they were Jesus freaks or whatever, whatever they called themselves. And it seemed like the way that they were holding up the Bible was making the Bible what we worshiped, instead of God being what we worshiped, or God in Christ who we worshiped. And that's much simpler than what you're saying, but sometimes that helps me distinguish. But it also raises the question, well, if I don't worship the Bible, which I don't do, how do I treat it? How do I deal with it? Which is kind of where I'm at right now. So that's just throwing that out there.
You're talking to somebody for whom the Bible was at first the sole authority.
Right.
And then I read the Bible faithfully from
I remember
elementary school through when I told God to leave me alone in middle school. I turned to the sky and I said, because I was so, and it wasn't because I wanted to be rebellious, it's because I felt so unhappy. And then I came back to faith sometime in high school. And then I was basically where you are with the Bible. And so parts of it I just didn't touch for years because of the way that it had impacted me negatively earlier on. And then that carried on into my mid-20s, actually. And it wasn't until the last 5 years where I have come to a place where I love the Bible now. So I'm not going to solve your problem. I'm not going to try to help you through in this very moment, but I've somebody who's gone through this journey with the Bible, this struggling, this grappling, and come on to the other side, loving it. Perhaps I can be of help.
That's very cool. Thank you.
I think the Bible just teaches me more and more about God all the time. if I can find it real fast. No, it's Zechariah. I discovered a new verse that I love. And it got me thinking about God. You know, scripture says God is love, but God has anger. God has ways that different descriptions of God. And I found this verse a couple of weeks ago, and it says, "Oh, it's all right. It's a book you read all the time. Zephaniah, 3:17. There's only 3 chapters, you know. The Lord your God is with you. He is mighty to save. He will take great delight in you. He will quiet you in his love." And this is the line I love. "And he will rejoice over you with singing."
Oh,
Now,
wow.
have you ever in your mind, when you're thinking about God, think about God singing? Is he up there with the heavenly host singing along with them? Is he the choir director? Is he in bass or is he a baritone? But he's up there singing and rejoicing over you. And that just brings such joy into my relationship with God that I know. I guess, I don't know. This is probably silly, but like I think, God's up there and that guy's not doing right. Oh, you're doing good job. No, he's bad. But no, he's taking time out to sing over me, to be joyful over me. It's not. It brings God closer to me, not a nice little pat on the head or shouldn't do that. But that's what the Bible is. That, to me, that's what the Bible is. It's only a way that I can go and find out more about God and what he wants for me to do.
That's lovely.
I love that.
As I interacted with this story this week, I had in mind that man who rang my doorbell at 1:30. And the conversation I've had with myself, to be clear, I still would not have answered the door. We have one of those Ring doorbells with the camera, and we were inside. We could see a shadow. We were still up. I could see a shadow, and we were just like, what does he want? We were really freaked out, and I wouldn't advise anyone answering the door in those circumstances. But I think the point and the way that the scripture that we went over today teaches me about God is to have this tension, this struggle between care for neighbor, care for stranger. In this case, it's competing with care for my family and care for my children and their personal safety. Perhaps I would have done it different if I were alone. Even then, I probably wouldn't have. But this conversation is the learning, is the struggle, is the shaping of my spirit as it relates to strangers. So the next time I see a stranger in a circumstance that there's far less on the line, I will have known what I feel my obligations are to another child of God. And so this story preaches. And I love that what you just read too. This idea that God sings over us.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, that's a wonderful note. Go ahead.
No. I was just going to say that's an expression of God's love. It's easy to say God is love, but then if you talk about singing, then that makes it so much fuller.
Yeah.
So much
Agree.
more real. I like that too. It's a good verse.
Yeah.
Well,
Not only that, but he will quiet you with all this anxiety that's going on in our world today. Not just the virus, but the forest fires and the hurricanes and the election.
Yeah, put that in there.
He will quiet you with his love. So you just take a deep breath and breathe in his love, and he quiets you.
That's
very good.
Wonderful note to end on. So this is where I'm going to conclude the recording. So see you all next week.
Okay.